The build show today, we're talking radiant heating. That's right. This is a really soft, even way to heat your house. However, full disclosure, I've never actually built a house with radiant heating because I'm a Texan and we don't need a lot of this. So that being said, I brought an expert with me today. I've got Eric Awney from Mechanical Hub out of Minnesota with me. Eric's done a ton of these installs. He's also done a ton of service on these systems. So Eric and I are going to talk about the pros and cons of 5 different methods for installing radiant heating for either your remodel or your new construction job. Today's video is sponsored by Uponor. Let's get going. All right, y'all, if you haven't met my friend Eric, Eric is a mechanical contractor, a plumbing and heating expert based out of Minnesota. He's probably better known, though, as Mechanical Hub on Instagram. Eric, thanks for joining me today, brother.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, so Eric, here's what we're talking about. We're talking about radiant heating in houses. And full disclosure, I've never built a house with radiant. Even though I've thought about it, I've seen houses, I've never actually done one myself. So I really appreciate you coming on. How many years have you been doing radiant projects?
I think the very first time I ever worked on a in-floor radiant system was in 1996, so a little while.
It's been a couple of years, and I started in construction in 95, so we're both old guys who have done this a few years, is what you're telling me here. All right, so first off, Eric, in your opinion, what is it about radiant for heating that makes it a really nice way to heat your house compared to forced air, which I've done a lot down here in Texas?
Well, I think there's a whole, there's a handful of benefits. First and foremost, I think what people notice the most when they experience a radiant heated environment, whether it's in their own home or they visit family members, that's often where my customers come from, is they come to me because they said, well, my sister has this in their house and we love it. Every time we go there, we want to stay longer. So ultimately, it's the comfort.
Yeah.
When you're not moving air, you're pulling less heat out of the human body, right? So we lose about 70% of our heat just through convection, and that would be air currents and things like that in a space. And we can closely match that heat loss through convection using radiant systems. So really, ultimately, we're creating by just with science, really simple science, like a more comfortable environment because we're pulling less heat out of the body. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it totally makes sense. Now, delivering that heat is interesting, Eric. If you think about this Uponor pipe right here, this is a 1/2-inch tubing, and this is typically the size you're using for your radiant projects, right? 1/2-inch tubing. Compare that to, let's say, a 10-inch air duct or a trunk line on a system that I might put in. You can route these through some pretty tiny spaces and not have to have a lot of crazy architecture or structural moves, let's say, to get that ductwork in, right?
Yeah, so like the 1/2-inch tubing is smaller than what I'm going to use a comparison for, like in ducting. A 1-inch pipe, a 1-inch PEX pipe, can carry as much energy, heat energy in it as an 8x12 duct. Dang. So if you can imagine the amount of energy we can carry in water versus air in a smaller, much smaller footprint, taking up less space for construction, whether it's how the building is designed or how we retrofit, it has such an amazing advantage.
Yeah, big time, big time. And quick plug for Uponor, who's our sponsor. The reason why I used Uponor piping in my house when I built my brand new house for my water piping was I love how flexible this is. This is a PEX A pipe, which can bend and move and be flexible. And as a result, I had very few joints at my house, very few, 90s or anywhere I had to cut that pipe and make a fitting. My assumption is, Eric, because of that flexibility, if you're installing a radiant system, you might be able to go from the cold to the hot side of your manifold with maybe even no joints. Is that true?
Yeah, so that would be our preference, actually. And so we can utilize that PEX A, like you said, Uponor's tubing, and we're able to snake it into smaller spaces. We're able to put it into our designed system in a way that we don't have to have any joints at all, which is a huge advantage.
Yeah, that's a big deal. All right, with that being said, Eric, let's switch gears and let's talk about install. There's kind of 5 methods as I look at the Uponor catalog for using their pipe in delivering that heat to the space. Let's start with method number one, which is actually this product on my desktop. Uponor calls this Fast Track. This is basically a grid that the tubing snaps into, and this grid has an adhesive on the back so that you could put this over an existing concrete slab, let's say, or even over an existing subfloor, route your tubing through this Fast Track, and then pour lightweight concrete on top of this. I don't think you've not used this method before, right, Eric?
I've not used that product, no, but it's really cool in how the tubing snaps into it and holds it pretty well. I know that much. I've seen it in use. I've just not installed it myself.
Yeah, and they sent me a kind of a quick clip of how it works. And what's interesting is they even have kind of a foam board that you put on the outside of your wall cavities so that your concrete isn't up against the wall. It allows probably for some good expansion and contraction. And then after that goes down, this seems like it goes down pretty quick. In the video, they showed two guys doing a pretty big, it looked like basement space over top of concrete, and they put this down over 300 some square feet in just 20 minutes or so. So I think this would go pretty fast. And if you're going over an existing, let's say, concrete slab and adding radiant, this seems like a pretty good retrofit method, doesn't it?
Yeah, I like that it's adhesive on the back, so like there's less fasteners involved. As long as you're working with a clean surface, that product is supposed to perform really well and staying put where you've placed it.
Yeah, I like that. That's cool. All right, so that's method one, and this really would be, I would consider generally speaking, a good remodel method over concrete or existing subfloor. Let's talk about the method, though, that I know you've used a lot, which is their Quick Track. This is a 1/2-inch plywood panel with aluminum on the backside. What situations could you see people using Quick Track for?
So Quick Track is very popular. Like out on the East Coast, they've done really well with it for years. So you can use the Quick Track on a subfloor. You can put it over top of a concrete floor if you've got some kind of barrier between it to get that aluminum and that plywood off the concrete itself.
Yep.
So you have to have a membrane between there. So maybe an extra step or material, but then it's also good for ceilings too, or walls.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. So that you could, let's say, put that panel in on top of your studs, snap your Uponor piping in, and then you can see the piping so that when you're installing, let's say, a sheetrock finish over a ceiling or a wall or a hardwood floor on a floor, you can actually see where that tubing is and avoid it for your fasteners, right?
Yeah, so you can use conventional methods for whatever those finished materials are, whether it's concrete or, like a wood flooring, a vinyl planking, or sheetrock, you name it. You can use all normal conventional installation methods because the tubing's exposed.
That's pretty cool. I've not seen that before. That's a neat product. All right, method 3, Uponor's Joist Track. This is, I think, probably the most iconic one for somebody like me who's not done a lot of radiant. When I think of radiant, this is kind of what I think of. Is this a method you've used before?
Yeah, so the Joist Track is where we're putting it up underneath the subfloor, typically in a joist bay, but sometimes even with, like your wood truss construction. What it does is it operates maybe with takes a little more energy to operate, but it allows for, we don't change any of the ceiling or floor heights or anything like that as far as, construction of doorways existing or stairways. And so it's a nice retrofit product, and it's a extruded aluminum bracket that goes up underneath the subfloor, and then the tubing snaps into that. That aluminum helps with the heat transfer, and it kind of makes the surface area of the tubing larger on the upper side of the floor, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. I hadn't thought about that. That's probably one of your biggest concerns when you're thinking about, especially retrofit, is what do I do with this extra thickness? And so that's really where Quick Track comes in, because it's in your floor system. You don't have to worry about doing something that's above the floor system.
Yeah, that's, I'm not a carpenter. I'm a plumbing heating contractor. I'm not going to rebuild stairways and raise all the doorways and stuff like that. If I got to put something on top of a floor, it's going to change elevations of everything. Yep. So you have to consider that on the design side. All
right. Now, the fourth method, which is, I know, a method that you've done because I actually saw you use this method on your shop that you are in the middle of building right now. Talk to me about the staple down method and kind of thinking about how thick is that insulation. What do I want to use? Metal staples? Do I want to use plastic staples? Kind of walk me through that process.
Yeah, so like in the case of a basement, we'll just talk about that. That's easiest to kind of visualize for everybody. You're building that insulation barrier between the ground and the floor, probably in most cases a high performing house anyway.
Yep.
Well, even if you're not going that construction method, that's what you're going to do in this case. You're gonna layer first with a extruded foam board or a polystyrene board, and typically in our area we use 2-inch foam, so it's got an R10 performance value there. And then we take this specialized stapler like you've got there, and we're using these 2.5-inch long plastic staples. They have these great big barbs on them, and they don't staple through the tubing. They hold around the edges of the tubing, and they secure that tubing right to the surface of that foam board insulation that you've covered the entire square footage of that basement, let's say.
That's pretty cool.
And in the design phase of things, we figure out how much tubing is needed per square foot, things like that. But we're applying it directly to that foam, and then the concrete's being poured over the top of it.
And then talk to me about layout for your piping. I'm assuming when you're designing the system, you're figuring out, okay, I need these pipes roughly 1 foot on center, 2 foot on center, whatever that is. And then are you simply just pulling a tape measure out and going, all right, let's mark our on centers, and then you have probably a helper with you to pull that tube out and staple it down to those rough measurements? How exact do you need to be?
Well, it's not an exact process, but I would imagine that, I think with my experience over the years, there's less and less tape measures involved, but I think the accuracy is still there. You've got a few things you got to keep in mind, and this is all either in the training you could receive directly from Uponor or from their online training in person, or even I've got this old manual that I've been carrying around since like 2004. It's like my Uponor Bible.
I want to see that. Show me that manual. I'm sure this is all available online, but I love that you've got the printed copy of it.
I don't know if you can.
It's even got the Wurzbo logo, which is their old name.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just it's like a few hundred pages, 300 pages of design and technical info on how to go about designing these systems. And so the design ultimately comes from, like, for tube layout and spacing, it comes from the heat load calculation phase. So none of this we're not winging any of it. Like when you're down in Austin, you guys are doing a load calculations for cooling. We're doing the same exact thing for a radiant system, only we're doing it for heating, right? And and I guess in some cases you can use these systems for cooling, but up here in Minnesota, we're using them for heating, and we're doing all of that science-based calculation, all the math for it. So that in that process, on the design side of things, we're coming up with things like tube spacing, how much tube is going to go into a slab, things that dictate that are like, how thick is the slab, what's the floor covering of the slab, because floor coverings have R values, or whether or not, like, if you've got a really high ceiling, because all of these things dictate what is needed to come, to heat or cool that space, right? Yep. You know that for any conventional system. Well, it's the same for radiant.
Makes sense. Have you used their LoopCAD design software at all before, or are you using it pretty much all manual out of the paper?
Okay, so I should clarify. So I use the manual, like the paper manual, as reference, but yeah, I actually do all the math on my computer using LoopCAD. Gotcha. The nice thing about LoopCAD, though, with Uponor's system is they've got all their catalog preloaded in there, so it helps me create quick and accurate material list for the job.
Got it. So your takeoffs are all in there too. Got it.
Yeah.
Now this is a stainless manifold from those guys that they sent me. Interesting that it comes in stainless. Any benefit to that versus another metal in your mind?
Well, ultimately, I think it's a manufacturing thing. Stainless can be used for distribution, for, potable water, for radiant. And there's just a lot more they can do with that because they're cutting down on different material sourcing. Stainless is just really kind of taking over on systems like this, ultimately.
Okay, Good to know.
It's corrosion free, basically. You know.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now this one happens to be a 5-port manifold. So the red is obviously from the boiler to the radiant zone, and then the blue is the cold line. In other words, the return loop. But when I see this, the first thing I think of is, oh gosh, you could have multiple thermostats in your house with multiple zones, and each one of these could end up having a different feed, let's say, a different amount of heat going to those locations. Talk to me about zoning and what you've done for clients.
Yeah, so like that's the beauty of like a radiant system when you're using a manifold for distribution like that. Each one of those, we call them loops. So, your top and bottom, supply and return, is a loop of tubing, right? Just like you explained. But every single one of those could be a different zone or combination of multiples, and you could have a whole wide range of zoning on that one manifold, or it could just be one, right? But we look at zoning just like you would for cooling, for any other kind of heating and cooling system. How is the room used? What is how are the occupants going to be most comfortable? So like usually bedrooms a little bit cooler, kitchen's cooler than the living room, that kind of thing. And so through distribution alone, like how we lay out the tubing in, let's say, an in-floor heat system, we can go room by room and we can make every single room a different zone if we wanted to.
Oh man, how cool is that?
So it's super flexible, and it actually, to do that is honestly, when you compare this to a ducted system, is way less expensive. Because it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense to make every bedroom in your home a different zone if you were running a ducted forced air system.
And the other thing I think of for multiple zones on forced air is, oh my gosh, if I had a 5-zone forced air system, that means I've got 5 filters that need changed on a regular basis. And depending on what type of system, maybe it's a big forced air system and I've got a filter I got to change every 6 months or a year. But if it's a VRF system or a cassette or a mini split head, I might be messing with those filters every 30 days. And you've got none of that with this system. There's no moving air. There's no, kicking up of dust or filtration of particles in the air. And not only that, there's really no noise associated with these systems, right?
Yeah, that's the thing that I think they come away from these systems knowing kind of 2 things, if they really stop and think about it, is how comfortable they were when they're in that space. But then ultimately, there's no noise. Yeah. Like a properly installed system, you're not going to ever hear it operating. And I don't know about anybody watching this, but I'll tell you, that's attractive to me.
Yeah.
I just, you could sit in your house in the middle of the day, nobody's around. It is going to be completely silent. That's pretty cool.
That is pretty cool. That's very cool. Eric, we talked about at the beginning of the video, we said we got 5 systems for you, and you kind of let the cat out of the bag a little bit as we were talking about Quick Track. But there is another method for installing, and that's considering radiant for walls and ceilings, right? Talk to me about that.
Yeah, so an awesome way to retrofit space is to consider all of the surface area in a room can technically be a heat emitter or like a radiator. That's kind of a term that people probably understand the most. So if we're not using in-floor heat in a basement, let's say, because the house is 60 years old, but people hate using their basement because it's never comfortable. Mm-hmm. I've been successful, and I know many other contractors have, and all of this information is available from Uponor. So I'd love to see it on their site, and don't take my word for it, but you can just turn the ceiling into your heat emitter or your radiator. And it doesn't change anything like we talked about earlier, floor heights. It doesn't change doors or anything like that, because you're really only giving up about an inch or 3/4 of an inch or half an inch of space. And you can actually make that your radiant panel. And it's radiant energy. You're not heating air. So you're not concentrating energy in a space that doesn't benefit the occupants.
Yep.
It's just energy that's going from hot to cold. Yeah. And, I know that's an oversimplification of it, but think about a space on a wall. Like, what is the first 4 feet up from the floor? Like, what are you using that for? You're not hanging pictures there. You're not that's just space.
Yeah,
and it's not really even usable. So you could consider like a wainscot kind of situation where you can turn that into the radiant panel for the space. And it is completely hidden and silent. and there's no duct openings that you got to worry about putting furniture over the top of or not putting furniture over the top of.
Right there on the entire wall or ceiling.
Right. And your ceiling, you're never hanging your pictures there, and you're not putting couches or beds on top of it. So it's a huge advantage. I think it just goes without. I'm so happy you brought it up.
That's cool.
I just get passionate about it because it's really cool. My customers that I've put the radiant ceilings in really, really enjoy that they were able to put this technology in a space that they thought wasn't even possible.
That's so cool. Quick Track really makes it pretty straightforward. I mean, it's not even much of a carpentry project. It's already, the panels already come with the track ready to snap in. So screw those panels on, snap them in, and add your finish, and you're done.
Even a plumbing and heating contractor can do that.
I love it. I love it. Eric, thank you for the knowledge, my friend. Anything I missed before we close out the video?
No, well, I mean, you touch on the stapler. You know, if people aren't familiar with PEX A and how it kind of goes together, especially with the Uponor system, you use that. Typically, we use the expansion tool. Mm-hmm. We can use that in our radiant systems too. So like those manifolds, they can have expansion connections on them. And you know, who doesn't like to play with like new tools? Like that stuff's cool. Yeah. But it's a trustworthy connection.
Yeah, it's an impressive connection, and I love that it's that there's frankly so few of them in the system, right? And ultimately, it should be less labor. It should be easier to install and easier to maintain and more reliable and durable long term.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. Eric, really appreciate you joining me, brother. Guys, if you're not familiar with Eric's work, as you could tell, Eric is passionate. He's smart, and he's really darn fun to watch. And by the way, Eric is making a video every single week over on buildshowNetwork.com. He, along with a couple others, were our latest contributors that we added at the end of 2021. And so if you're not familiar with Eric's work, I'll have a link in the description to both Eric's Instagram feed. He's at Mechanical Hub on Instagram. Almost every single day he's publishing from his job sites, showing you all kinds of really cool things from his plumbing and heating jobs. And then sign up for our newsletter below too, so you'll know Eric's new content on the site. You can get that on that link below. Big thanks to Uponor for sponsoring today's video though, guys. This is a great company with some terrific products. And if you're not currently using Radiant, reach out to an Uponor dealer, plumbing contractor, heating contractor in your area to learn more about this, potentially for your remodel or your new construction job. Eric, you want to close it out with me? Do you know have you ever heard me say the Build Show closeout before? Follow me on Twitter and Instagram. Otherwise, we'll see you next time
on the Build Show.